So first of all, let me just say welcome everybody. We have a fantastically large group here. Thank you all for showing up. I'm told over 200 people are here. Welcome to the penultimate Spring 2021 lecture of our 1619 series, which commemorates the 400th anniversary of the landing of those 20 or so Africans in British North America. We've had already a really great series for 2 years, and today is not going to be any different. Today's lecture is just going to add to that. So we're all happy you're here, and we're all happy for the ways that you helped make this a really good series, have helped to make it a good series, and continue to do so today. I want to really quickly just thank all of the people who have helped to make this possible. First of all, the department chair, Scott Levi, who initiated this series. The committee that worked very hard from the start to come up with a fantastic list of scholars from which we selected our various speakers. To all of those speakers whose work educated us further, entertained us, and just helped us to think harder. We're grateful. We also have had the involvement of a number of staff people, Laura Seeger, who's in the room, who has been invaluable in assisting us with technical aspects. Rhonda Maynard, Chris Adams, and Steve McCann have helped us in various ways as well. Thanks to the Department of African and African American Studies, co-sponsor of this series, the Center for Historical in the Room runs. We run this series out of that center. And so thank you especially to John Brooke. We also owe thanks to Dr. James Moore, the director of the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, and the Ohio Energy Partners, both for their generous and critical their critical and generous financial support, which started with their belief in the importance of this series. And particularly since the COVID crisis wiped out the university funds that we originally had for this series, those two institutions really made it possible for us to do this year. So a special thanks to them. And finally, thank you to the audience, to those of you who are here for this program. Thank you for showing up. We know that this could not be a success without your attendance. We know that you are critical to our success. And we know that even with the constraints that COVID has placed on our ability to just hang out and do whatever we feel like doing, in the public sphere, we know that even though that has changed, you still had the option of being someplace else this Friday afternoon. So thank you very much for choosing to be here. And that's all I have to say. And I think John Brooke has a word to say, and then my colleague Hasan Jeffries is going to introduce this program. So Hasan, maybe he's not. Maybe you should go on. Yeah, I think that there was a little bit of confusion about whether I was going to do an introduction to the series.
Yeah, no worries. I can channel my inner John Brooke. And if John, if you are on, or you want to hop on and say something, absolutely no problem. Welcome. But until we hear from John, let me just say welcome everyone to, as Dr. Shaw, my colleague, was just saying, to the penultimate presentation for webinar for our lecture series. It really has been a dynamic and thoughtful and thought-provoking lecture series, and I believe that it will continue on today. We're shifting the focus a little bit, moving. One of the things that we have been doing throughout the entirety of the lecture series has been moving chronologically through time, literally starting 1619 and earlier, and then moving to the contemporary moment. And so we find ourselves sort of in today. And the focus of today's webinar lecture series is on the Black athlete, the sport, and protest. Because of course, there's nothing going on in the news central to the Black athlete sport and protest. And we got two brothers. We're gonna have a good conversation today. And let me introduce you to them, two dynamic scholars, two dynamic brothers. First, we have Dr. Derrick White, professor of history at the University of Kentucky down in Lexington, Kentucky, in both AFAM and history, author, and you can see it to the right and to the left, of two amazing books, The Challenge of Blackness, The Institute of Black World and Political Activism in the 1970s, and Blood, Sweat, and Tears, which focuses on something that's dear to me, which is the Black college experience, and more specifically, Black college football. Although as a graduate of Morehouse College, I probably attended one football game because that's exactly where we were putting our energy at the time. Not exactly a powerhouse in the world of the SAIC, but that's a story for a different lecture. And of course, a graduate of the Ohio State University. Earned his PhD from our history program here many a moon ago. And so this is one of our distinguished alumni. And so Derrick, it would be wonderful if we could have you in person, but hopefully the virtual will serve as a little bit of a substitute. But thank you so much for joining us, and I'm very much looking forward to the conversation that we have this evening. And we have both a partner in crime with me and a partner in crime with Derrick, Dr. Lewis Moore, who is associate professor of history in Michigan at Grand. I always want to say Grand Rapids, Grand Valley. What do I say? Am I right? Grand Valley State University. There we go. But in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and who does wonderful work. Focusing on sports, African-American history, of course, sports history, gender history, undergraduate degrees from Cal State, Sacramento, got that left coast flavor, bringing it here. Author of two wonderful books, two powerful books as well. A Fight for a Living, his twins, as he calls them, A Fight for a Living, and We Will Win the Day, the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Athlete, and the Quest for Equality. Also the author of a powerful and enlightening series on Audible originals called The African American Athletes, or African American Athletes Who Made History. And so, brothers, I invite you both to unmute your mics and for us to start this dialogue and conversation on the Black athlete, Black protest, and sports. And let me, before we begin, actually, let me just say to our audience, to our listeners, that and those who are viewing, that if you have questions, please make use of the Q&A feature. We will go probably to the bottom of the hour, bottom of the 5:30 hour, with some conversation between the three of us. But I will be monitoring the Q&A, and I will try to get as many of your questions in as possible, even before the 5:30, but certainly after that 5:30 hour. So please make use of the Q&A, and we will keep an eye on. I will keep an eye on that as we move through the conversation and dialogue. And thank you again for joining us. I know there's a lot of other things that you all could be doing, and taking this Friday evening out. We all really, really appreciate it. So, what's happening in the world of sports today, and how does it connect to the past and to the present? We don't have to look very far, i.e. like within the last 24 hours, to see the ways in which sports, race intersect and protests intersect. We just had this case of the basketball coach, head men's basketball coach at Creighton. And maybe Lou, I follow Lou more on Twitter, and Lou was lighting this cat up, who, in his post-game speech, now correct me if I'm wrong, post-game speech in order to rally the troops. And we're talking about Creighton men's basketball, Division I basketball team, of course, majority, the African-American players. He's like, in the post-game speech, ladies and gentlemen, he says, we got to stay on, what is it? We got to stay on the plantation, right? Don't run off the plant. I mean, this was supposed to rally these Black folk, these young Black men, right, to the cause of playing better. Now, there have been some consequences as a result of that. But Lou, could you say a little bit more about just this incident, but not just the incident in isolation? And then Derrick, I welcome you to chime in, but not just the incident in isolation, but how do we unpack that moment and then also unpack the response to it?
Yeah. Thank you for having me. First, I'll let everybody know if you see me looking at this way at any points, because my kids will come down in the basement or something, or if you see me looking down, I'm trying to say something on Alexa to essentially tell them to shut up. But that's that Zoom life for you. But yeah, when I read what he said, Coach McDermott said of Creighton, I was like, man, this is he's saying the quiet part out loud, right? And what I mean by that is what we all should understand is that there's a lot of economic exploitation going on in big time college sports, right? Especially basketball, women's and men's basketball and football, right? Whether you're at Ohio State, sorry guys, or whether you're at Creighton. Right. And this coach makes multiple $1 million. Creighton and the Big East stand to make a lot of dollars off these young men making it to the NCAA tournament, which is $1 billion a year industry. And when he says stay on the plantation, that's exactly what he means, right? It's not, some people say he misspoke, but it's really him understanding in this moment the situation that he's in. He is as I say on Twitter, he is the overseer of these workers here. He is the guy on June 19th, 1865 in Texas, begging people to stay on the plantation and work for the least amount, right? Whatever an education at Creighton, if they get an education, right? So I think that was the very telling part. It's even more telling to me that nobody spoke up. No coaches, right? From what I've seen, no white coaches so far. From what I've seen, there's been several Black assistant coaches who've been put in this position, who have to say something, but none of them have condemned them. But 2 weeks ago in basketball, they spent a lot of time condemning a freshman at Duke who left the team, or so to speak, who left the plantation to prepare for the NBA to actually make money. And so by them not speaking up, to me, that's telling. And I'll say one more thing before I'll shut up and pass it to my partner in crime. We were on this, we have a podcast, the Black Athlete Podcast, and we talked about this subject a couple of days ago. And one of the things I was talking about, I was like, look, if this happened in 1968, either that coach would be fired or there would be a major boycott of Black athletes, not only at Creighton, but around that conference. Right. Those guys would not be playing each other. They would not play Creighton. Black athletes wouldn't. And a great example is this. I brought this up. Oregon State. Black player was asked to shave his beard or his mustache, and he thought it was racially motivated. And the players from Oregon State walked off. Right. They boycotted. But not only that, players from other institutions that were Black players that were playing against them. And I just think those players back then, I'm not knocking these guys, right, because they have a lot at stake, were radical in their actions, right? They weren't just waiting for the university president to do something. They understood the power that they did have, and they would have taken it right away.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much to add to that other than I think, as Lou says, he says the quiet part out loud. I think this is the thing that college sports in general, but these revenue generating college sports, men's and women's basketball and football in particular, they really do speak to the kind of inequities in terms of power relationships and in terms of salary, right? That the men's and women's basketball as well as football fund the entire athletic department. And so when you're talking about, the impact of the NCAA tournament for Creighton, it's not just about their basketball program. It's about their tennis program as well, or their golf program, or then what we think of as non-revenue sports as well. And so this is, he's reflecting his own interest, but he's also reflecting the interest of people who are not in that room, right? The athletic, if you're the coach of the golf team at Creighton, you are also rooting for the men's basketball team to get it turned around, in part because the money that they will receive from the NC2A tournament, if they get each round, that money is going to trickle back into their golf program. And that means, additional recruits, additional recruiting trips, more equipment, et cetera, et cetera. So there's incentive for the entire athletic department, right, to invoke this. And so him speaking this phrase out loud, this kind of thinking out loud, is not just him in his own personal beliefs, but is reflective of the way the entire structure is set up from top to bottom.
You both mentioned sort of the notion of there's a particular kind of politics that are playing out here that garner a particular kind of response from both those who are in the administration, those who are in the circle of coaches, but then also the athletes, and that has changed over time. I want us to sort of take a step back in time a little bit. As long as we have had both organized amateur athletic sports in the United States and organized professional sports in the United States, we have seen discrimination. There has been a color line. It hasn't been a hard and fast line. I mean, you have Black athletes who were playing baseball in the late 1800s before we get that hard and fast Jim Crow line. So it has fluctuated and has changed. Well, my question, and Lou, I'll come back to you, and then we move forward because Derrick, I want to talk specifically about some of the ways in which Black folk have responded. But Lou, what have been the sort of the politics of race, right, in terms of creating a color line in sports? Like how has that played out? Sports is a reflection of society, so it's not a surprise that there's a color line there. But is it just merely that, or does it manifest itself in particular ways in sports that we can see in this early 20th century era?
Well, I think part of it is why we like sports in general in America, and that is there's this belief in America that meritocracy exists, right? The best person wins the day, and we look to sport to prove that. Now, it's easy if we're in the 19th century, early 20th century, it's easier to say that when there's discrimination, right? When you're keeping Black folks out or you're keeping Native Americans out, right? So it's important when Carlisle gets in and they're dominating, people, whoa, what does this mean? So when you set up sports as something as a meritocracy, something about manhood, and then also racial superiority to let Black athletes in, means that you're going to have to deal with those challenges. So in boxing, what they did, and I talk about this in the hit book, I Fight for a Living, shameless plug, they drew the color line, right? Not only fighters, but states, right? Part of progressive reform in America, as I talk about in chapter 6, I Fight for a Living, is, drawing the color line to make sure that white people don't see a Black guy beating up a Black guy beating up a white guy in the ring, right? They keep him out. But in the South, they saw if we just jump a little bit, post World War II America, sports was so important to America because it proved that, look, we might have fought this war in Jim Crow, this war for democracy in Jim Crow, but we're moving on as a society. And the best way to prove that then is to have sports, right? To have a Jackie Robinson excel. Or even before that, if you're Ohio State and you're discriminated against Black students, right? And you still got Jesse Owens and stuff like that. But to have these athletes excel on the football field, and it's only like one or two, right, at this moment, right? But it's like proof that we can move on as a country. Now in the South, they're looking at this like, oh man, we don't want to do anything about this. And one of the things I talk about in the hit book, We Will Win the Day, is after you get Brown v. Board of Education, 1954, the South really cracks down on integrating sports. There was like a small opportunity where you'll see maybe a Sugar Bowl, right? The 1955-56 Sugar Bowl is in New Orleans, one Black player. After that, they're like, we can't have this. Because for them, they're saying, if we integrate sports, then the schools have to follow, right? So now by this kind of the civil rights era, for some folks, it's proof that America can move on. But for other folks, sports becomes this kind of Trojan horse of what's going to happen, right? These people who don't want to move on. So sports, and I know you're gonna pass it to Derrick, but sports has been like really important how we see how our society reacts to not only race, but just the optics of inclusion, right? The potential of inclusion.
And one of the things that when we think about American history, and not just about sports, but American history more broadly, and we think about the color line and Black folk trying to break these various ceilings, whether they are breaking the sports and Jackie Robinson, whatever it is, we almost think of it as like Black folk, a Jackie Robinson or or whoever it is, sort of standing outside of the baseball stadium, just like, hey, could you let us in? Could you let us in? As though like that's all they've been doing, right? Just waiting for white folk to sort of say let them play in the professional leagues, and ignoring the Black professional sports, Black professional circuits that don't have the same level of resources and certainly not the same media attention, but it's still organized sports, as well as the rich tradition of sports in Black colleges. I wonder if you could say, Derrick, a little bit about sort of that legacy, that history of parallel institution building in which we see Black organized sport that is both amateur and professional.
Yeah, I mean, I think, much like Black life, right, that once the opportunities of integration after emancipation get rapidly closed during Reconstruction, Black folks, build and fund their own institutions, right, their own lodges, their own churches. I mean, this is very much part and parcel of the African-American experience. And the sporting experience is no different, right? And so we see this in various realms and in various ways, right? In the early, as baseball is trying to figure out its color line, even as early as the 1870s, you see a whole host of Black led and ran baseball teams, including Frederick Douglass's sons playing and organizing their own teams. And when we see the development of Black colleges, once extracurricular sports get into the collegiate and the Black college experience, football in particular is one of the first things that they organize. In 1892, we see the first Black college football game. And by World War I, we're talking about hundreds of Black colleges are playing, football and developing these rivalries and leagues and their own customs on the front end of World War I. And this, of course, coincides with what's happening, as you noted, in the professional ranks, right? That professional baseball, as baseball itself becomes more professionalized, Black organizers begin to organize their own professional baseball leagues. We see the similar kind of trajectory in basketball. We see a similar trajectory even in women's basketball, right? Not only at the collegiate level, but also what we think of as pre kind of professional women's basketball. And so Black colleges and Black organizational and Black sporting spaces are developing. And so in some level, it's a twofold problem, right? I'm always reminded of Ralph Ellison's review of Gernot Myrdal's American Dilemma, right? And he says that, after this massive and I think, intricate review, he says, can Black people just exist by reacting, right? Are they just simply reacting, or can they make a life on the horns of this dilemma? And I think that Black folks in general have made a life on the horns of this racial dilemma in America. And making that life means that they create institutions where they are not always worried about integration, that integration is not the foremost thing in their mind, that they are about creating their own culture, they're creating their own rivalries, their own communities, and their own economic spaces for which these things can exist. And that the nature of integration for many of these folks is not just individualist, like Jackie Robinson. They want the entire league, right? They want the Homestead Grays to be included in Major League Baseball. That, Coach Gaither, I talk a little bit about in my winning book here, Blood, Sweat, and Tears, since we're doing book shout outs. One of the things that Jay Gaither always makes the claim is that he wants the Florida A&M to come in to be integrated as a unit, because they were by many accounts the most dominant team in the state of Florida and one of the most dominant teams, Black or white, in the Southeast. And he knew that his team and his players, along with many other Black colleges like Eddie Robinson at Grambling and Mumford at Southern, they believe their teams could compete with the best institutions in the country at the time.
When thinking about the color line in race and sports, so moving forward from these foundations and Black folk creating these parallel institutions, alternative outlets for playing sport, and we move to sort of that that the mid 20th century was starting to see waves of desegregation in various sports, baseball and then basketball to a certain extent. Slowly, when we get there and we tell the story of the desegregation of sports, and I think, Lou, this goes a little bit back to your question of how sports plays out in our imagination and in our public consciousness. What is the usual narrative that we hear about sort of integrating sports and how that impacts sort of players and teams? Like I mean, because I think, let me I think about sort of Jackie Robinson, right? So Jackie Robinson, you know, breaks the color bar, and then suddenly, like, every Italian and Jewish kid in Brooklyn loves Black people, right? And it's like, yes, we did it. We've achieved, right? We've overcome. It's like, really? That really happened like that? I mean, so what? And in the movie 42, right? The last scene is a little kid, little white Italian kid, right? It could be a Italian white kid, right? In the elevator, he's like, Jackie can't get in the front door. You know, him and Robin can't get in the front door to receive this award. And then, you know, he's given this, you know, like, hey, or maybe that's race. Actually, it's a different movie, but same principle.
You
right?
combine Just Cause and Jackie Robinson.
They're all the same.
They both got little kids who are happy at the end, right? And
they both part of the Great
like,
Migration. Yeah, great athletes for the Great Migration.
Yeah, same thing, right? Yeah. And it's like, this will say, like, performance will say, but could you say a little bit about sort of that narrative, right? And like, right. And why do we get so obsessed with it in that sense?
Right. First, before I start, I want Derek's favorite movie is Do the Right Thing, and his favorite scene is that scene where my man's talking to Spike Lee about Black athletes, right, and Black singers, right? And right, Derek, go ahead, just tell the story, because I know you love telling this.
Because it's the way we imagine it, right? That Black sports and entertainers, that, you know, he says, you know, who is your favorite player? And he's like, Michael Jordan, right? Like, and who's your favorite singer? Prince. And he's like, why are you talking, like, how are they your favorite players? And then you address these Black folks in your neighborhood with the N-word. And he's like, but they not that, right? Like, that's not who they are. Like, I don't even see them as Black. Like, there's somehow more. And I think that's one of the things, I'm gonna jump in here, Lou, because you done gave me a lane, I'm gonna take it. That one of the things I think we see in that space, right, that narrative, is that sports is reflects this American kind of exceptionalism, that even though we've had all these kinds of trials and tribulations, whether it's the Civil War or it's our long legacy of slavery and segregation, that sports fits into that narrative probably so neatly than anything else. Is that not only do you have these courageous individuals, right, that we don't just tell the story of Jackie Robinson, but we also tell the story of the white teammates, right, or Branch Rickey, who are the white allies who put their arm around Jackie Robinson and make him feel okay, right? And I think that is a part of the way we like to imagine sports, is like the way we like to imagine our own history, that the success that we see on the courts and on the fields and in arenas is somehow replicated in real life in our communities. But as you know, and I know, that, you know, the scholarship about the lived experience of Blackness vis-a-vis what the way folks think about and imagine sports are very vastly different.
Yeah, and I'll just add on to that, because I was just gonna say is that, look, the stories that we know that we could recite easily, whether it's Jesse Owens or Jackie Robinson, right, generally either have a white ally as the hero, right? Like 42 is not as much as about Branch Rickey as it is about Jackie Robinson, right? The story that we tell about NFL integration is usually not the story of the Rams, except they did it this year for the Super Bowl, and I like to say that that's partly what I've been talking about for years, right? I have a piece in African American Intellectual Historical Society about how the NFL has been pushed to this moment of this Black league because of not white allies like a Paul Brown, who certainly was, but from Black protests, right? But from Black players. So the story of the Rams and the Browns is different, right? The Rams moved from Cleveland to Los Angeles, and it's Black sports writers and it's Black activists locally pushing the Rams to have to integrate, right? And then they get Kenny Washington and Woody Strode. Cleveland's story that the NFL spent a lot of time celebrating, right, was one of Paul Brown, a white guy who said, you know, I'll all black team if I could, right? Color doesn't matter. He had three. Bill Wills, who Ohio State, Marion Motley, and Horace Gilliam, right? But that's this idea, right? So we celebrate him, we celebrate Branch Rickey, and then we also ignore everyone else who took forever to integrate, right? I was to say baseball doesn't really integrate. Look, they integrate by 59 with Pumpsie Green in Boston, but the South is still segregated when those players have to go to spring training. Now, the Dodgers get around it by Dodger Town, right? Every other team, now Cleveland, if you guys are Ohio, they'll eventually go to Arizona. But guys like Larry Doby, he still faces discrimination in Arizona. What ends discrimination in Florida is the black players pushing back, right? And saying, we're not dealing with this anymore. And by 63, it's integrated. I'll tell you one more story that kind of sums up how we do this, right? And I mentioned this before, is that we look to these stories, right? And Jackie certainly has a book. It's called Baseball, like we did it, right? And it's about celebrating baseball and getting through for integration. But I'll tell the story of Levi Jackson. Levi Jackson was a football player, one of well-known football players in the 1940s, and was voted captain for the Yale football team in 1948. And it was honestly one of the biggest stories of that year, because Yale, although Yale's an Ivy League team, school, it's Southern Ivy League, right? And it's his white teammates that say, you know what, we want the one black guy on our team to be the captain. Now, the story was really about how nice of a guy Levi Jackson was, right? But it was really about his Southern white teammates, right? And it's and people were literally writing, that's it, America, democracy is here. We've done it, right? You don't need a Paul Robeson anymore. We have young, young whites who will do this for us. Now, we know that's not the case, but to me, what sticks out is 20 years later, Levi Jackson was like, man, it was messed up, right? Like this was like, it was torture being on this campus, right? We focused so much on the whites, and we forgot that what it was like for this lone black player, right? This lone black, probably one of the few black students on campus. It's the same thing with Harvard. The first black player to play in the South on a PWI team is Chet Pierce of Harvard, right? And he goes and he plays in Charlottesville, Virginia in 1947. Almost 30 years later, he's the one who invents this term microaggressions, right? And I think there's a connection to that. This guy who grows up with in football, right, as the race, the barrier breaker, who years later is like, man, there's so much stuff we need to kind of unpack here about race. And it's not just the inward, it's these everyday little things I have to go through.
Can I just add another lane on this as well? And that's also to think about the Olympics, right? Because what is also happening at the same time about this narrative of this integration narrative that we like to sell ourselves is not simply about Jackie Robinson, but it's also about the way that America imagines itself in the world, right? And so we, at Ohio State, you can't go a semester without someone bringing up Jesse Owens, right? And it's also that Jesse Owens, that narrative of Jesse Owens, but also Wilma Rudolph in 1960, is that both before and after World War II, before World War II, this is again America demonstrating that it is so quote unquote not like the Nazis, right? As they're emerging. On the other side, men and women athletes like Wilma Rudolph are playing a role inside this idea of the Cold War, right? So now we're demonstrating ourselves, and we know that the broader international politics is that the politics of decolonization, that folks in the continent, in Latin America, in the Caribbean, are looking to Russia for support in their decolonization projects, right? And so these Black athletes begin to function like they have a particular role. Their success in the limited space of track and field or basketball or whatever it is very important. But the way that they function in the global context, right? The way that we think about, Penny Von Eschen's great work on, thinking about race against empire, right? That sports plays an active role in that international context as well. And so it's not only an important internal narrative for us, but it's also an important external narrative that we sell to the globe and to the rest of the world.
The era of desegregation, or at least integration, color barrier breaking, we can see right around World War II, generally speaking. and then proceeding for the next 20 years, right? I mean, it's not, a one and done thing overnight, right? I mean, you talk about 2 decades, a quarter century it takes, right, to actually get not full desegregation, but at least to break the color barrier in most of these teams. Southern sports start later, right? In the 1960s, you're talking about SEC continuing into the early 1970s or so. Is it safe to say, like, I'm thinking, I want to shift to the response of Black athletes in particular. Is it fair to say that the late 1960s to the early 1970s are the high water mark of protest for Black athletes?
For college students, I would certainly say, yeah. And I'll use just an anecdote over this summer. I thought, and I've said this several times, so I was asked in June to do a presentation that was going to happen in December, and I was like, I know what I'm doing, Revolt of the Black College Athlete 2.0, because these kids are not playing, right? Because in a post George Floyd world, where they're out there not only forcing their coaches to say Black Lives Matter for the first time, but the racial slights that they get as student athletes or someone else gets on campus. Kansas State athletes are saying, we're not playing until this is resolved, right? Texas athletes, USC athletes, all these athletes, I was like, they're not playing. And then they play, right? And part of the reason why they played is the rules that came up after these athletes from the 60s, right? And what you have until 69 and then 1973, there's some changes in 69 and 73, but the main ones in 73, these are 4-year guaranteed scholarships, right? So if I protest and my coach kicks me off the team, technically, if I didn't quit the team, I get to keep my scholarship, right? By 1973, these are one and dones, right? So now all of a sudden, if I'm a troublemaker, right, with limited opportunity to transfer, by the way, right? If I'm a troublemaker, now I'm off, now I'm gone. And I think what's important is the narrative hasn't changed for these young Black athletes when you tell them this is your one shot, right? We saw that part of the reason why that Ohio State, the Iowa.
What happened?
Iowa. Part of the reason why, I didn't say nothing about y'all tattoos, but part of Iowa, right? The reason why the strength and conditioning coach at Iowa gets fired is part of what these students are saying is like this mentality that we're going to send you back, right? You're going back to the ghetto if you don't do this, right? And what's always been hanging over these students' heads, whether it's the 60s, 70s, 80s, and now, is like, damn, I got to go back, because they realize they're not truly being educated here. The difference was, man, those students in the 60s and 70s, they didn't not necessarily care, but they knew that this was their moment, because there's a moment around them, right? This is how Ohio State gets Black studies, right? It's these students, they're part of this conversation, whether you're at Ohio State or San Jose State, right? They're part of this movement of students. They're connected. Nowadays, no knock on Justin Fields, who should go number 2. I don't even know if he ever steps on campus, right? Like, part of the design of big time college sports is to keep the athletes away from the general population, right? I'm sure you guys, I'm at a little bitty school that some people say is a Grand Rapids, right? It's Grand Rapids. We don't have a lot, but they got nice locker rooms, right? And the football players stick together. Can you imagine at some of these schools where they have a lazy river, or they have the recording studio, the barbershop? All of this is designed to keep those student athletes away from the general population, because when they connect, you get Missouri, right? Missouri 2015, when those players said, oh, what's going on campus? Okay, we're not playing. And the president's fired. You keep them away. You give them all these treats, like Frederick Douglass says at Christmas time. You give them all these goodies. Man, I'm getting the swag back, right? Like, oh, okay, do you see this 40-inch screen TV I have in my locker room? And so the universities have figured out a way to really keep players in check, because they can't honestly look at this coach making $5 million, you making nothing, be like, yeah, I'm okay with that, right? So there's something that's keeping them partly in line, and part of this is how the universities treat them.
Let me just add this thing about Missouri and how we keep folks isolated. Having worked at like 3 different types of institutions, but a regional institution in Florida where student athletes, the athletic structure does not allow for students to keep that kind of isolation. At a Florida Atlantic, for instance, at an Ivy League school where athletics takes a back burner to athletics, and now at the University of Kentucky, where you have this traditional kind of SEC power. That is very much part of the way we keep the students isolated. And it happens that it's not just keeping them away from the general students and lots, trapped in the locker room. Some of us about geography, our colleagues in Black Studies doing geography, thinking about ways space works, right? That a lot of times the practice facility is not near campus, right? It's not even a walk that you got to drive. I know Ohio State, I know where it is vis-a-vis University Hall to the practice facility over there at the Woody Hayes Center. That's a hike, right? You got to have a scooter, or someone's going to drive you. You got to get on the bus. I mean, for us who had to ride the bus, right? Like that's how it works. And so once you get to the facility, then they're not trying to get you to leave. Study hall's there, right? All the things that you need to rehab is there, film is there, all that's designed to keep you in that particular space. The interesting thing about Missouri that I think gets overlooked is that the captain of the football team, as well as the student body president, was an African-American man who, but him and the starting strong safety were both members of the same fraternity. And so when people are looking like, well, how did this, jump the shark? How did this protest that started with a graduate student with a hunger strike that involved the students jump all the way over to the athletic department? Those connections. And I think, coaches are starting to figure these things out. Like, you don't have time to go hang out with those kappas or those alphas or those omegas. We don't want you to do any of that, because really that forces these kinds of interactions that we begin to see. And it creates the possibility for something like Missouri to happen at that particular time. And so I think that's as important as anything else. Those facilities are also, going back to our original point, are the enhancement of these facilities is also a byproduct of the rapid increase of the money that as universities, as nonprofits, athletic departments as nonprofit, if they're making money, they have to pour it back into the salaries grow up, but they also pour it back into facilities. And one of the reasons they justify not just giving you a scholarship, they say, look at all these facilities that you have that's us, you're getting, $500,000 in tangible benefits in facilities. There's a great example I use, and this is probably at least 15 years old, but at Ohio State, this is local. At one point they had, I want to say, over a dozen ice treadmills. I don't know if you guys know, like an ice treadmill it is a very interesting contraption. It allows you to get ice time, work on your skating, etc. And there was a report, I want to say, from the early 2000s that said Ohio State somehow had 25 of them, right, for men's and women's hockey. And this is them pouring money back into the athletic. And this is amazing. And at the end of this article, they were like, the NHL only had like 7 in the entire NHL. So these is professional hockey players don't get this particular kind of device because they ran at the time like $30,000 a piece or something crazy like that. And these are the kinds of things that we see. So they're selling this as saying, look, this is the justification for for you only getting a scholarship and training table and board, right? Like this is all you get. But we get all this, professional coaching and these things. And that's supposed to keep folks content. And I think that one of the things that this summer really had the potential to do that didn't kind of come to fruition, as Lou notes, is that there was a moment where students were like, that ain't enough. We got to talk about these other issues. We got to talk about the eyes of Texas. We got to talk about the Confederate flag in the state. We got to talk about the way these strength coaches been talking to me for the last 4 years. Like all that stuff that was basically people had been eating because they were too scared to challenge for the loss of their scholarship, were now able to be brought to the forefront and brought to light in a variety of different ways.
I wonder the extent to which some of that fevered pitch, because it was strong during the summer, as we hit the fall and the possibility of sports, college sports in particular, opening back up and schedules coming online, one of the things that was required of athletes to do was to isolate. I mean, if there was further in other words, if in normal circumstances we're talking about isolation, right? Like this was extreme isolation now, right, for all athletes. And I wonder to what, in order to play, like if you don't isolate, you're not playing, right? We run the risk of getting COVID. But however, whatever the thinking is beyond that, I think one of the effects of that had to be sort of this exacerbating that separation and that isolation at a moment where it was already difficult to be in touch and be in communication, but it really furthered that it made that line hard and fast.
I'll just add,
go ahead.
I think that's important. There's a twofold. I think there's two sides of that. I think one is definitely that increased isolation. I think two, they're not even going to class because everybody's on Zoom like this, right? So part of it is that this is the perfect scenario for micromanaging your student athletes. But on the other hand, the issue at the Pac-10 that they had in the Pac-12 with the student athletes were calling for economic justice. And it also, the Zoom and technology that the student athletes have been developing allow for them to actually organize a much bigger protest than anybody had imagined. It wasn't just simply individuals at particular schools. That was a conference-wide protest, right, that you had folks talking from Washington State to UCLA. And I think that was also exacerbated by the very same technologies and isolation that sent them back to play. So it was, I think there's two angles and two sides of that equation.
When we come out of, we're entering into March, and we're going to have some version of March Madness going forward. I mean, that was, I think the pandemic became real when March Madness didn't happen, right? I mean, that for a lot of people, like, damn, like, okay, like this is when y'all shut that down. We understand that what's at stake here. It's hard. I remember, I was still young, but I'm old enough to remember when March Madness wasn't madness, right? I mean, it wasn't the industry that it is now. It was always important, but not now. I was thinking about Michael Jordan. I'm of the Michael Jordan era, right? I mean, Michael Jordan was I remember seeing, him in, early 1980s, 1981 to 1984, Michael Jordan, UNC. Charlie Scott, who was the first African-American to play at UNC, to hit the hardwood, right? At UNC, it's 1967. That's only 13 years before Michael Jordan. Like UNC now, you can't imagine UNC, right? You pick a team. I mean, it could be Kentucky, it could be anybody, right? Mm-hmm. That's only 13 years before. I mean, in other words, how close we are to the era of literally complete segregation is almost, I mean, we forget it. And then the impact of desegregating something like college sports in terms of what then it becomes, we get to March Madness, is really in other words, the point, it ain't that long ago when we were dealing with that, and now we're dealing with something completely different. But what are the legacies of that history, right? That immediate, and I think one of them, Lou, perhaps is what you were talking about. Suddenly you get a change in sort of, you're now one and done, right? You were no longer given 4-year guaranteed scholarships, right?
Yeah, no, so part of it, and I was gonna say, one of the things I say is we were watching, what's that thing that we all watched, that 10-part Michael Jordan series, Last Shot, right? Last Dance. Hey, like Jordan, Worthy, Barkley, these Southern guys, these Southern Black players, they're the first generation to grow up in integrated schooling, right? We forget that. I mean, if we think about that, like how close you are, Michael Jordan is like, he starts his life in integrated school. Charles Barkley starts kindergarten integrated school, right? It's that close to us. When you ask about legacies, it's not only the transfer of the team going from all white to a couple Black players to all Black. I remember when Illinois goes to the Rose Bowl in like 47, they have like 4 Black players, and it's a huge deal. Right now, it's like completely flipped. Right. But I think part of the legacy is when we talk education, what happens to how you get in. All of a sudden you have prop, whatever. What are we at now? We're like prop 14 or 42 now. But you start talking about these these education requirements, right? And people like, oh, we care about your grades, but they don't really care about your grades, right? We start to deal with all these other institutions, and now once you get the Black athletes for the first time, I think you start to get the academic resources, right? That part of the increase of Black athletes is also comes with more money coming to academics, because NCAA has to continue to put on that facade that these are student athletes first.
I want to take another way of thinking about that as well, right? There's tremendous cost to Black organizations, right? Like we think about the end of the Negro Leagues when we talk about Jackie Robinson, like how quickly that happens in, like in a decade. The Negro Leagues is, are selling out, Comiskey Park. And then a decade later, they're like, man, what happened to the Negro Leagues? I mean, this is how quick this turns around. But in my work on HBCU sports, right? HBCU football, you see the same kind of thing. It's a much later period. So when the University of Florida decides that they're going to recruit Black players in 66, 67, they can't touch a candle to the kind of legacy that Black players have at Florida A&M. But rather quickly, because they have all these resources, they've had state funded stadiums that are much bigger, that they are able to both legally and illegally recruit Black athletes to their campus. You also get this very different kind of dynamic, and a dynamic that when we think about the protests of the 1960s, one of the interesting kind of dynamics is that we don't see Black student athletes leading protests at Southern institutions. It's really this weird kind of anomaly in the process, right? They may demand, they'll demand, they'll make individual demands, but you don't see this you don't see Syracuse, you don't see Wyoming, you don't see Washington or Washington State. You don't see that happening at these particular Southern institutions for a lot of different reasons. But the cost of desegregation on that legacy has been that Black colleges no longer are seen as the kind of institutional segregation that Black colleges face in terms of funding and all these things become more exuberant, in part because these predominantly white institutions are now using that kind of legacy advantage to really strip away the athletic talent. You can only get someone's story like Dexter Manley. I look in historically Black colleges to see, what was the graduation rate? What was, do you have any of these cases? Not all the guys at HBCUs graduated. That's an impossibility, right? But
now hold on, Derrick. You have to explain. Now I know who Dexter Manley is.
I'm gonna get
You
there.
know who Dexter Manley is.
Get there.
So Dexter Manley is for many places was a multi-year All-Pro for the Washington. I can say the Washington Redskins, now the Washington football team. Won at least one Super Bowl for them. Was a captain. And it came out when again my age in 88 or so, 87, 88. There's a big case about how he was functionally illiterate. And he had gone to Oklahoma State and gotten a college degree from Oklahoma State and was functionally illiterate after playing 10 years in the NFL. And there's a big case of him being on Capitol Hill explaining his this need for kind of adult literacy, which is a fantastic story. But like I look for that case. I look for a similar case in the Black press about HBCUs. And that wasn't happening because even when Gaither was like, I'm taking these kids from one-room schoolhouses in Florida, right? He was like, everybody, the entire institution was like, you got to get up to speed. There's a great story. If you've ever watched the documentary Black Magic on HBCU basketball, John Chaney talks about how when he went to Bethune-Cookman, he talked about showing up with just 2 pair of pants and 2 shirts, right? Like this was the thing. And he said, anytime he went into the office, and if he asked for a professor and the secretary, he used improper grammar, the secretaries corrected him. She's like, I don't know who you trying to ask for. Like, young man, like, this is how you need to do. And so there's an entire institution. That documentary, one of the big themes is from Errol Lloyd to John Chaney talking about the institutions wrapped their arms around these young men and women and provided them with a kind of opportunity. You don't see that. We talk about in Sports Illustrated, there's a fantastic series of articles on the Black athlete. We think about Texas Western in UTEP when they beat the University of Kentucky in 1966. None of those Black guys graduated initially. Like they had dropped out of school. So there was already an interesting kind of exploitative moment in that initial desegregation moment. And I think that, whether we talk about this legitimate concerns by the NC2A about academic reform, it's also the fact that they needed to do this in part because the way PWIs were exploiting these Black athletes in a way that Tennessee State was making sure that, you might have ran fast, but you also went to class, right? So this is part of the way that they were operating as an entire institution. And that's a tremendous loss in the cost of desegregation that gets lost in this discussion.
And can I also add,
yeah.
I just want to add, I thought Derrick was going to two things. One, how great these players were, right? I think we forget that teams like Grambling, Tennessee State, even and Florida A&M, they're putting out more pros than the PWIs, right? So we're talking about real pro players there. Tennessee State, their defense put out back-to-back, their secondary, all of them in the NFL. I think the 71 draft had like 9 players from Tennessee State. If you look at Kansas City Chiefs, when they win early on, that 69-70 team, that's all filled with HBCU talent, right? And so what gets lost is the same thing with Negro League Baseball. A lot of times that talent, it's no knock on, HBCUs now, but a lot of times that talent doesn't go. It goes elsewhere. Once that talent's gone, then you start to see there's another whole host of problems, but then you start to see that kind of that talent decline, if you will. No one's clamoring as much to watch these games. Whereas I was talking to Derrick last night, that Orange Blossom Classic was a big deal that Florida A&M was playing. The other thing, and I think this is a great opportunity for Derrick to remind Ohio State, y'all had an opportunity to hire who? What's my man's name?
Who are you talking about?
Late 70s when he went to Florida A&M.
Oh, Rudy Hubbard.
Tell Ohio State how they messed up.
Ohio State, in Blood, Sweat, and Tears, there's a strong Ohio State connection. Bill Bell, who was the first coach at Florida A&M to win a national title. Jay Gaither gets his master's degree. Both him and Bell get their master's degree in physical education from Ohio State. When Gaither retires in 1969, a number of his assistant coaches had master's degrees from Ohio State. And then when they looked to revive the program, they hired Rudy Hubbard, who was an assistant coach, who's now in the College Football Hall of Fame and the Black College Football Hall of Fame. Rudy Hubbard was an assistant coach under Woody Hayes, who recruited most notably Archie Griffin to Columbus. And so, there is this really interesting kind of relationship between these between PWIs and we see a similar relationship between Michigan and a couple of different institutions in the South. And so I think there's a lot of this, but Gaither was always saying, going back to Lou's last point, that the white coaches, many of whom he saw in the summer at his coaching clinic, they wanted the Black players. They just knew the politics were not going to let them recruit them. And I think that was part of what was happening. They were going to the Orange Blossom Classic and recruiting. And once the NFL saw this talent emerging and leading teams to championships, it was only a matter of time before the University of Florida is like, we can no longer allow Florida A&M to have the best talent in this state. And so what are we going to do? And so I talk about that a little bit in my book as well.
We have a number of questions that have come in, and some fantastic questions. And actually, I think both Derrick and Lou, you both kind of answered one of the questions, which was about the differences between HBCUs and predominantly white institutions. And she was asking about the geography. Is it the geography, as you were describing earlier, Derrick, that helps explain the difference? And, I'm thinking, one, yes, in part, you don't have the same kinds of resources now, certainly, to create that kind of physical separation in the same way. But from your answer before, it's more than just physical space. It seems like it's what's happening within the spaces, what's the motivating factor, what's motivating the instructors, the coaches, and the like.
Yeah, I talk about that Black colleges from their inception always struggled with material resources, right? That they never had enough funding to do the kind of work that they've done, but they had an overabundance of human resources. And it's those human resources that were instrumental in developing the entire institution. So it's not just simply what's happening in the football field, but it's also what's happening in terms of activism. My classmate and fellow Ohio State alum, Jelani Favors' book, Shelter in Time of Storm, talks about this legacy of activism that emerges from historically Black colleges. That's very much part of what's happening in these institutions from top to bottom. And so the athletics are not any different in that. But what happens with desegregation in particular is that now the material resources are a matter in different kinds of ways, in different kinds of contexts. Rudy Hubbard most famously said, his entire recruiting budget was like $5,000. This is like 1977, $5,000. And he said, when I was an assistant at Ohio State, I was spending more than $5,000 on long distance phone calls, right? Like this is how the night and day operation is working here, right? And so these institutions, right, they had an advantage because not every Black student, even if they were recruited by Ohio State or Michigan State, schools that would occasionally recruit in the Deep South, they didn't want to go that far away from home. So Florida A&M was something that they knew, and they knew they could be successful there. But now you get that Florida and Florida State and Miami are all in play. The congressman from Utah, Burgess Owens, is a perfect example. His uncle was a professor at Florida A&M, and Gaither actually talks about this in the press, that he thought he was coming to he just like, I knew this guy was coming to Florida A&M. His legacy, like this is how we built this program. And Burgess Owens very clearly was like, look, I would have gone to these Black schools, but I want to go to the University of Miami, because he saw that as, he said, I got a better chance to make pros. And I was like, that's an absolute lie, that you could just account for the number of pro players in the NFL in the past from Miami to Florida A&M. And that was not there, but really it was the proximity to whiteness, right? The predominantly white institution provided something that he saw as being seen superior to what HBCUs had to offer at the time.
Well, and real quick, I'll just add, one of the few protests within the last, or athlete strikes or boycotts from college campus within the last decade happens at a HBCU, right? And it's scrambling, and just shows you the lack. And part of what they're doing is protest the lack of facilities that they have, the lack of opportunity to get nutrition, the lack of equipment in the weight room. But part of the reality is that they were never set up to be like Louisiana State or Florida. Part of that is lack of state money. Part of that, when we talk about the NCAA, just up until 1986, NCAA controlled TV contracts. They're not putting HBCUs on TV a lot, right? So if you're not getting put on TV, you're not getting that money funneled to you. And then what the big institutions say, we're not sharing with you, right? And so this history of not getting TV money, and then when you can make your own TV contracts, no, outside of that Grambling Southern game, a lot of these TV networks, they're not running to the HBCUs, right, to put them on TV. So the way they make money is getting beat up every week by, the first week, right, by Ohio State, by LSU. They have to take these money games, right? And that's the sad state of where they're at. So when we talk about facilities, they're not set up to succeed and even to compete. And I don't know, since we've talked about this on the podcast before, I don't know, Deion Sanders or not, how they do that, right? And we can also talk about how Deion shouldn't have been playing in a city that had no water. That's another conversation for another day.
But it's connected. We have. I want to pull on some of the or draw our attention to some of the questions that have been coming in. So we'll kind of hit and scattershot a little bit of the subjects and topics, but I mean, I think that we have some really good ones. My colleague David Stebbin asked a question about baseball. One of the things that we have seen over time is that the ratios of racial ratios have changed and shift, right, within sports. And so he asks, is the reduced presence of African-American players in Major League Baseball in recent decades something special to that sport, or does it reflect a broader social trend? Either way.
I just say the lack of baseball, there's a lot of things that's going on with baseball, right? You've had an increase in basketball and Black players going to basketball and football, right? And decrease in baseball, but it's not that simple. Part of it is just access. Baseball is a suburban sport now, and it's priced itself out. It's like, I'm sure, we're all middle class, but we know we got kids. Soccer costs a gang of money. I'm sure Derrick will tell you. Baseball, I was talking to another guy who runs a baseball academy, And he was saying for his daughter to even play softball, it's almost $6,000 a year, right? It's you're paying for, you need the hitting coach, right? Because the middle class people have set this up and said, oh, my kid needs a hitting coach. My kid needs a trainer, right? And then, oh, we got to play travel ball. That's another $1,000. We got to go all these other places. And baseball's become that, right? You need a pitching specialist. You need a hitting coach. You need to play travel. You need the best bat. And a lot of these kids just can't afford that. The other thing that baseball did was, and we grew up in this era, you're probably a Mets fan. You had one good run at it. You had Doc and Darrow, and you haven't left. You haven't left.
Just hitting low. Just hitting low. I have not.
You
You're right.
haven't left.
You're
86.
right. Damn it. I'm still riding 86. You're right.
That's right. But if you think about it, how cool those guys, even to this day, I could post something about Eric Davis on Twitter, and everybody like, oh man, he's the greatest. Think about how cool, minus the drugs, we talk about Doc and Darrow or Eric Davis or Bo Jackson or Kirby Puckett, all these 80 stars. Baseball did nothing with them, right? They let the basketball had the Michael Jordan. These guys were just as big because it was baseball, and they just let it go. They did nothing really with Ken Griffey Jr., who might be the coolest person ever, like greatest swing, hat backwards. They just let it go, right? So part of this is baseball not really caring about trying to get that Black player, because they're so much invested in getting other Black players, but just not in America, right? They're in the DR, right? Where all these teams have baseball academies, right? They're in Puerto Rico. They've got baseball academies in Venezuela, trying to build baseball academies in Brazil. All at the same time, they've lost track of really who helped grow this game.
I'll just add, institutionally, I think we saw desegregation destroy Black Little League. I think that one of the things that we think about, like, I don't know what the scholarship, if anybody's done this, is really detailed, but like, if you think about the way segregation worked and the way Little Leagues operated, like, do we see, the closing of particular teams and they have to move across town? Like, I think that there are some kind of variable, some of those variables are also at play. Like, it's not just simply financial access, but it's also just physical access and proximity and for after school and for your team in the summer. And I think that some of that is very much tied to that as well.
Okay, let me just add then, since we're talking baseball, there's this great documentary that talks about the greatest baseball player ever, Eric Davis. It's called Harvard Park. It's about Eric Davis and Darryl Strawberry. They grew up, there's a park by them. They could play baseball, right? Now, what happens to these parks? If you're in California, you lose a lot of public access to parks because Prop 13, right? When we're talking late 1970s and lowering taxes on housing, right? Which means that we're not going to have a lot of public services. That Jackie Robinson West baseball team that made it to the end of the World Series, when they got in trouble because they had kids, right, living out of their league districts. Well, part of that is these are poor kids who got to move a lot, right? And then we talk about how baseball changed. The first Black team, by the way, if you guys are interested, to a full Black team to make it to the Little League World Series, I believe, is from Gary, Indiana. Lloyd McClendon, who wound up going to the pros playing catcher. That was it. I think that's late 70s. But a Chicago team made it, and a few other teams, but there's not these whole teams anymore. And that's why Jackie Robinson, that team, and their star player does make it. He gets drafted by the Cubs, I believe, this year. That's why it's such a big deal, because it's such a rare thing to have an all-Black team make it because of how much resources go into the sport.
Yeah. I tell you, growing up in New York, so this is late 70s, playing in the 80s, playing Little League baseball, my brother and I, we there was no Little League. We lived in an all Black neighborhood and had to hop on an R train to go to an Irish neighborhood, right, to play in a Catholic league with 3 or 4 other white friends, because there was no all Black team in our neighborhood. Now we could play basketball, right? And this wasn't New York City, it wasn't big football, right? You could play basketball, lots of Black basketball teams. If you want to play baseball, you were playing one of the Catholic leagues. Right. We were in the poor Catholic league. I didn't realize, I thought I was in the rich Catholic league, and it was the poor Catholic league, right? The Irish Catholic. That's how we were, right? That's how we were rolling. We had some other really good questions. Pablo, my man Pablo, student in my class, he asked, why is there such a distinction, if you see one, in the culture of protest between professional sports and collegiate sports after the summer of 2020?
It's guys like LeBron or players like Renee Montgomery. They have, or even Cat, there's a cushion that they could sit on that I think that the college players don't have. And I think what changes it is 2012, when the Miami Heat wear their hoodies, right? And there's no real pushback when we talk about a corporation pushback to these guys. I think where a lot of pro athletes were reluctant to get involved, because most of the stuff we talk about the 60s, those are college athletes, right? A lot of the pro athletes, there's Bill Russell and stuff like that. When we get in the 70s, they're you don't see them as much, is because they're getting endorsements now, right? And they're not losing that extra money, and they make a lot more money. They're not willing to risk that. But once you get someone like LeBron, D Wade, and Chris Bosh wearing hoodies, and there's no blowback, then I think it clears the lane for other people. And so that's why we talk post 2020, right? George Floyd, LeBron and More Than a Vote, Renee Montgomery taking off the season, now part of the owner, the WNBA, and Vote Warnock, right? They're comfortable in this space because for about almost going on 10 years now, this space has been created to allow them to be part of this.
Dr. Shaw has.
Derrick, did you want?
No, I just want.
Yeah.
Dr. Shaw in the quote, and I don't want. She's got her hand up on our thing, and I want to make sure that I acknowledge my former professor. So I'm gonna be diligent here and be a good student.
Dr. Shaw, if you want to unmute your mic or your camera and join us and ask your question.
Yeah. I have an observation and a question, and the observation is a quick one. It goes back to the very first point that Lewis made. And I know you were talking primarily about college athletes at the time. I think not professionals, but I just want to point out the women of the Atlanta's WNBA team, who, when they came out wearing Black Lives Matter shirts, and their owner, the famous or infamous Ms. Loeffler, I think that's how you pronounce her name, told them that they couldn't do that. They couldn't wear those shirts. And so when they came out for the next game, they wore shirts that said, vote for, what's his name, Warnock, the Atlanta minister who's, not Atlanta, the Georgia minister who's running for, who ran for and won the Senate seat. And then, just a few months later, she was pretty much forced into selling that team, which is what they wanted anyway. So I just wanted to say that, on behalf of the WNBA. And the question that I have is for Derrick, and it's for his point, the point about this internal and external imagined reality, that because, we have these sports figures who've made it, that, perhaps, or actually you said it more definitively than perhaps, but that as people imagine that, I guess we've overcome or something like that. And I just want to push a little back on that, because I think about, that may be in my mind, that's the way white people maybe try to represent it, but I can't imagine any Black people feeling that way. When Jesse Owens comes back from the Olympics, the best job he can get is as a janitor. That's the 30s. In the 50s, Althea Gibson, I saw her behind you, Lewis, on one of your books. She comes back from winning Wimbledon, and she, and within a very short time, she almost starves to death. I mean, somebody finds a white female benefactor who basically starts sending her money just to keep her alive. And so I'm just having problems with that internal and external, imagined narrative, of somehow having succeeded. And I also just would point out one quick other thing, and there's no question attached to this. It's the move of the St. Louis Hawks to Atlanta in the 60s. But I don't know if it's true, but what I always heard was that the people in St. Louis said they were sick and tired of watching all these Black boys run up and down that court. And they had actually stopped going to the games and stopped, and they were losing money. And, that kind of, and that's the 60s, and it's the late 60s. Mm-hmm. So anyway, that's all. I just want to hear more about this internal narrative, the external narrative.
No, so I think of it when what I was referring to as kind of internal narrative is about the ways in which the broader America, not Black folks, because Black folks have Black folks are very much making this claim. They are very clear about it's the Black press that note that Jesse Owens can't get a job. It's the Black press that talk about the fact that our very best athletes who show up, especially in the Olympics, have a difficult time getting kind of jobs, like that kind of adulation that you see for on the national front does not matter once they return. And so I see that as the internal narrative about the way that race relations function in the United States versus an external narrative versus the ways in which the foreign policy, Cold War, World War II, that race plays a function in those narratives as well that are equally important. And so I think those two, I'm not talking about how Black folks, I think Black folks see this are very clear, but they're also aspirational, right? I mean, Ed Bancroft, right? E.B. Bancroft, not, yeah. E.B. Henderson, E.B. Bancroft, help me out, Lou.
Henderson.
I don't know. I'm in history. I got me thinking about Bancroft. E.B. Henderson, one of the big things he does is like the first kind of African-American sports historian is talking about the greatness of these athletes, but he almost, even though he's working in HBCU spaces, most of his writing is about Black players at predominantly white institutions. He's writing about Matt Bullock, and he's writing about all those early guys who are playing in New England, because he saw that Black athletes in these PWI spaces as examples of integration and the possibility of integration. So it's not that Black folks are excluded from those narratives, but they're much more realistic, in part because they're also fans of the Negro League. They're also fans of HBCUs. They like the Orange Blossom Classic more than they like the Rose Bowl, right? Like, they understand that there are certain kinds of things, but there are these moments in which sports can do a lot of additional work. Lou talks about this as well. And Jack Johnson, most people, Black folks didn't like Jack Johnson. They thought he was a little too reckless, but when he's the heavyweight champion, everybody likes Jack because they understood what he symbolically stood for at particular moment in time. And so I think that there's always these kind of shifting narratives about race and race relations that sports is able to do. Going back to our initial point, Lou, about this narrative of meritocracy, this language of a level playing field that America likes to tell itself. We're actually using a sports analogy to talk about the idea of equality in America. We're like, oh, it's all now a level playing field. That playing field logic is very much rooted in the way that we imagine the possibilities of America, and both the stories of sport and outside of sport challenge the way that those ideas manifest.
Yeah, and let me just quickly text you. I know there's a lot of questions we have to get to, but yes, St. Louis does in '68. They moved to Atlanta, and so there's a couple of Black papers in St. Louis. But the one St. Louis Sentinel talks about this in '68. They're very clear that they moved because white fans aren't going to the games anymore, because the Hawks at that time were starting 4 to 5 Black players. And so they're like, we can go to the hockey game. And it doesn't mean that they didn't we'll do that again, the Cardinals, who had like 4 or 5 Black stars on their team, right? It's just that the idea that these basketball team goes from all white to all Black just like that is too much for them. But on that point about Jesse Owens, and then I'll stop, is Jesse believed in that too, right? And he spent a lot of his later years in sports, he's wildly popular because he didn't counter that narrative about, right? He was upset he didn't get that job, but eventually he gets a job. And he always believed, he writes a book about it. It's called Black Think, right? He always believed that sports was the best way for Black Americans to succeed. So when the revolt of the Black athlete happens, which is a revolt against that narrative that this is best for you, right? They're revolting against all that Cold War stuff, right? That's the whole revolt. Is he's actually uses his platform to push back against those guys, right? To even during the Olympics in '68, he goes there to ask to make sure that they don't protest anymore. And he says, I'll get you a job. And they tell him, you're not going to get us a job. You came back racing horses, right? They're trying to get him to see that for 20 plus years, we've been celebrated and there's no opportunity for us. And he couldn't do that.
Thank you.
How would, I'm sorry.
I just said thank you.
Okay. How would paying college athletes change the dynamic of power and control and autonomy, control over self-image, image and likeness, name, image and likeness, and the like going forward. If do you see that happening? If it happened, how would it change those aspects of controlling name, image, likeness, and other going forward?
I think it's, I
Go
think,
ahead.
well, I'll say politically, I think it's one of the, you know, we talk about bipartisanship. It's like one of the only issues that you see Republicans and Democrats agree upon pretty vocally. You'll have a liberal state like California pushing name, image, and likeness, and Florida is pushing name, image, and likeness, right? And as the two ends of the kind of political spectrum from both the state legislature as well as the governors. I think that I think what it will do is it will allow for student athletes to be fully invested in this relationship and see it as they won't be equals by any chance, right? Because they still don't get to call the plays, but they will be in the ways in which they feel like they have much more of a voice in this kind of environment. I think it also takes into consideration this wildly different kind of marketplace that exists where, there's a whole genre of employment called influencers that didn't exist a decade ago, right? Like, and what is, and so how does one become an influencer? One just has to be insanely popular and tell people on Instagram that they should buy these 3 or 4 different things. I think that's, it's not being different than endorsers, but they don't necessarily have to get into these kind of different entangled relationships as an endorser of particular kinds of products. So I think that there's possibilities. I think one of the things that gets tossed around, and this is kind of one of my big pet peeves, is they're like, well, where's the money going to come from? And I'm like, the money's always there. Steve Spurrier said the quiet part out loud one time when he said, when this issue was broached, when he was at South Carolina, he said, kids want to get paid. Okay, I'll pay them take $1 million out of my salary and we'll have the money to pay them X amount. Right. And they were like, you're not supposed to say that out loud. Like, I think because the salaries are the only reason that the salaries for, I'm gonna use my institution. So, Coach Cal makes $9 million a year, 8 point something million dollars as the head basketball coach. And that's only possible to pay him at the state as a state, right? We're like, one of the poorest states in the country. Right. This is not like, this is not like a state that is flush with cash. This is a state that's built on coal and tobacco and now bourbon and horses, right? It's extremes. And he's like $8 million. He's by far the highest paid person in the state. And so, you can't tell me that there's not money to pay the players when, why can't we pay him $5 million and have $3 million for players? Like there's a legitimate kind of question that you have. And if coaches feel like they deserve more money, then they could do what like all of us as professionals do, go up to try to be a professional coach and be Bill Belichick and get $12 million as a professional coach, coaching men who get paid Tom Brady, who was making $40 million his last year as a New England Patriot, right? Like, I think there's a possibility for us to do that. And as academics, we know this very clearly, like, the strength coach makes more than full professors in arts and sciences, right? Like if I had known that I should just have focused on lifting weights.
Water makes you weak. Just say,
I don't even have to lift weights. I just have to yell at someone else to lift weights, right? Like
a plantation.
Right.
And then and Chris Doyle was making $1 million a year as the strength coach in Iowa.
You saw that video of that coach stepping on those black players with the weights on them, right? That, I think that doesn't happen. We said, what's the changes? And the great places that doesn't happen. That, hey, we need to stay on the plantation doesn't happen. There's a reason why Nick Saban left Miami, because you'll have control, but you don't have the same amount of control when you're talking people getting paid. But I think the problem is, and why they don't pay it is, it's not just amateurism, but I think America is really uncomfortable with young black men having money that they don't think they earned. And that's what they don't want, right? They're worried about, my man coming in with a nice new whip and rims and stuff like that, and they don't think he earned it, even though he's making, the coach $9 million, right? Even though Urban Meyer is getting all this money, right? Instead, they want him selling jerseys for tattoos, right? And that's what they're comfortable with. And then when he gets busted for that, they're mad at him, right? For doing this, right? Because it ruins their opportunity to win national championships. Yeah, taking one last dig at Ohio State football program, but let the man sell his jersey.
Yeah, I feel you, man. I mean, I'd like to also thank you for Betsy DeVos. Going forward, one of the things that I think is also important to keep in mind when we think about sort of revenue and where this money could come from. Talking about TV contracts, right? I mean, across the board. I mean, one of the great arguments that you hear is, well, it would create an uneven playing field, right? Talking about even playing fields, right? Well, there were some teams that would have more and some teams that have less. Like, you don't have that now, right? Like, what are you talking about? Have you seen who goes to the playoffs the last 4 or 5 years? The same teams. But when we think about TV contract, right, there's more than enough, and everybody gets a cut, right? There's more than enough. There's more than enough money flowing around that if we really want to do it, we could do it. And I mean, just to build off your point, Lou, and then we'll wrap up. I want to hear, give you guys a chance to give a sort of close statement. One of the things that we see, to your point, Lou, is that, when we see young white girls going pro in tennis, right, and young white guys golfing, right, like, that's not a problem, right, in terms of the money that they may make, right. It's not a question of maturity and young and age and stuff. But when we change that up, then suddenly it is, well, who actually earns this, right? Just as we see in so many other ways, in so many other contexts when it comes to race, you have the deserving people who deserve sort of aid and assistance and people who don't, right? I mean, that concept, I think, doesn't stop when we step onto the diamond or to the playing field. One last quick question to get your final thoughts for both of you, and it's kind of like the Martin Luther King, like, where do we go from here? Question for Black athletes. Derrick, I want to ask you this, and then Lou, I want you to ask you kind of the same question, but on sort of sports and college organizations. For Black athletes, where do you think what's on the horizon? What do you, if you could put on your projection cap, where do you think Black athletes and protest, where does it go from here?
I think we're going to continue to see a generation of protests. I think we are in the middle of this direction of Black athletes at the professional level. I think, as Lou pointed out, that the fear of potential loss of endorsements it has not come to fruition, and I think that's given people a certain kind of freedom. I also think that the politics of the moment, right, that these athletes, right, there's a number of NBA players who faced police brutality in the last 3 or 4 years, and it's a stark reminder to the fact that their wealth is not a form of protection in the ways that they may have, the way that many people imagine that their wealth is. At the collegiate level, I think that one of the things that we're going to see is more agency of players, not only players within the program. We see this now within the transfer portal, that student athletes are really have like taken in. I think this year we talked about thousands of players in the transfer portal. I think there's a lot to be seen about how that actually plays out in terms of their own agency, but the fact that they're no longer trapped, or the threat, as Lou said, of we're going to send you back home, that players are recognizing because of the internet and social media that they are able to make connections to other coaches and be able to continue their kind of career. The other part of player agency, I think, that is, to me, and this is always my point, the most crucial, is that the incoming kind of athletes, especially the ones highly recruited, have to recognize their power in this equation. And it's unfair to ask them of this. But as you know, as a scholar of the civil rights movement, it was unfair to ask children to be at the front lines of those marches as well. And that college sports' change is not going to come from the current players. It's going to come from future players making decisions based on what's happening now. And I look at this issue at the University of Texas, where the donors announced in various clear ways that they were not appreciative of critical race theory, infecting their locker room, as well as they were upset that the players did not like this school song that emerged from a minstrel show. That players, the elite players, have to say that, you know what, we'll give the people what they want. Like the OJ say, we ain't coming, and we'll go someplace else, and we'll go to an institution that values us not only just as student athletes, that as people as well. And I would really like to see personally that this happens in two ways. One, that many of them, especially at the mid-career Division I level, start to really consider HBCUs again. I think this is the power of not only Dion at Jackson State, but also Florida A&M's new announcement that they are going to be sponsored by LeBron and Nike is going to be, I think, very beneficial. And at the other is that the elite players have to, I think they should consider taking their talents to Black coaches, right? That you don't have to play for Nick Saban to get to the NFL. It increases your odds, yes, or Ohio State, it increases your odds. You have better odds, but that ain't the only game in town. And that Mel Tucker or Mike Loxley or James Franklin or other Black coaches, Herm Edwards out in Arizona, that if we want to change the way these coaches act, and we want different class of coaches, different types of coaches with different experiences, whether it be Black or Latino or others, the players have to not continue to do the same thing. The elite players have to go to different kinds of institutions. And I think that's where the power is, but that's asking a lot of a 17-year-old who grew up watching Alabama or Ohio State in the Orange Bowl or the BCS, the playoff every year. And that's a hard challenge to convince them to go to Michigan State or Arizona State or Maryland in these particular times. But to know that, part of the broader discourse has to be, they got to know that they can get to the NFL just as easy from those places as others.
Thank you very much, D. White. Appreciate it. Lou Moore, how do you think, last 30 seconds, which can't be answered, but 45 seconds. How do you think decision makers are going to respond, both Division I college athletics, NCAA, and professional sports, to if we see a continuing groundswell of activism from Black athletes?
Yeah, I think they're scared. I think since we have about 30 seconds left, we look at the strike in the NBA that happened in August. We haven't seen another one since, right? I think that scared them because it's a money thing. But the difference between pro and college is that you got to talk to those pro guys about how much money they're actually losing, right? And so I think you didn't see a follow-up because they understood, the pro guys, there's a market to this next. We have a CBA. I think colleges are always scared. And that's why in June, you saw presidents immediately talk to those students and they put out statements, right? Which kind of put out the fire. But I think at a certain point within the next few years, we're going to see students. I thought we were going to get this from the Pac-12, right? And then the Big Ten countered it with let them play, right? I think there's going to be a point where student athletes are going to say enough is enough.
Dr. Lewis Moore, Grand Valley State University, author of I Fight for a Living, Over the Right Shoulder. We Will Win the Day Over
Check
the
out
Left
that De La Soul album. Yes.
De La 3 Feet High and Rising, Tribe Called Quest behind. I see it representing really nice. OSU alum, Dr. Derrick White, D. White. Great to see you. Thank you so much for joining us. The Challenge of Blackness, and of course, Blood, Sweat, and Tears. Gentlemen, it's been an honor and a pleasure. Thank you. And I look forward, and for those who have joined, you can follow both of them on Twitter. You can follow them on their podcast. What's the name of the podcast again?
The Black Athlete.
The Black Athlete is available on wherever you listen to your podcast. So the conversation will continue on from there. Thank you very much. Let me turn it over to my colleague, Dr. John Brooke.
Yeah, I'll just say a few things. Thank you all for coming. And we had a record turnout today and a great session, a riveting session. So we hope to see you again soon. Thank you very much.